The Battle of Cannae sits in the human memory like a scar that never fades, not because it was the biggest battle of ancient world, and not because it ended the Second Punic War, because it revealed something permanently uncomfortable about power. Size is not safety, courage is not immunity, and momentum can be turned into a noose. Rome arrived on the plain near Cannae, believing that it had finally built the instrument capable of crushing Hannibal. The Roman Republic had been shocked at the Trivia and humiliated at Lake Trasimene, and it had endured the long unpopular patience of Fabius Maximus, who tried to starve Hannibal of opportunities rather than give him the spectacle he wanted. Yet the Roman political bloodstream wasn't designed for prolonged restraint. It was designed for decisive action, visible triumph, and public credit. A city that measures prestige by conquest doesn't easily tolerate a strategy that looks like avoidance. So the pendulum swung back from caution to confidence. The Republic raised an army of unprecedented weight, stuffed it with citizens and allies, and marched it to bring the war back into the old Roman grammar. A massive central collision, a shattering, a rout, a victory that could be carried home in speeches and sacrifice. Hannibal understood Rome's psychology than many Romans did. He understood that after enough humiliation, a proud system begins to crave a single redeeming blow. He understood that the Roman state, by its very structure, was tempted by scale. If previous legions had failed, then more legions would surely succeed. He also understood that the Roman way of war was both formidable and predictable. Rome was a machine built to generate heavy infantry, to impose discipline, to push forward its thick ranks, to break a center by sheer pressure, and to interpret success as the visible retreat of the enemy's front. When Rome pressed, it pressed hard. When it smelled weakness, it surged. When it gained ground, it believed it was winning. Hannibal's genius at Cannae was not only in inventing a double envelopment in an abstract sense, but by building a living trap that weaponized Roman habits. He didn't merely defeat an army, he manipulated a doctrine. To understand why Cannae became a byword for annihilation, it helps to begin with the atmosphere that produced it. The Second Punic War had started with the Carthaginian commander doing something that looked almost insane, marching from Iberia across the Pyrenees through hostile territory and then over the Alps into Italy. That invasion itself was kind of a psychological assault. It took Rome that the Roman the normal map no longer applied. It told Rome that a rival could violate the assumed boundaries of risk and still arrive with an army intact. It also told Rome that Hannibal wasn't playing for small outcomes. His early victories reinforced the message. At the Trivia, he used terrain, timing, and cavalry to smash a Roman force. At Lake Trismen, he used ambush and the fog of war to destroy another. Each defeat was more than a tactical loss. It was a wound to the Roman belief that its system naturally produced superiority. Rome responded with Fabius, a man who understood that Hannibal's greatest weapon was Rome's impatience. Fabius tried to deny Hannibal the kind of fight Hannibal wanted. He tried to keep the Roman army alive, to preserve manpower, to protect allies, to harass supplies, to make Hannibal's position in Italy strategically uncomfortable. It was a rational approach. In the long arc of the war, it helped Rome survive, but rational approaches that look like restraint often become politically hated because they starve the public of the emotional drug of decisive victory. Rome's public and political class wanted closure. They wanted a battle that erased the shame of earlier losses. They wanted a war to end on Roman terms. So Rome raised an enormous army, a kind of national fist. The idea was simple. Hannibal could win when the odds were manageable. He couldn't win against overwhelming mass. This is the seductive logic of scale. It has appeared in every age. It cannot solve a problem with skill, solve it with volume. If you cannot outthink, outnumber. If you cannot adapt, then crush. Rome's leadership chose to meet Hannibal near Cannae, a place connected to supplies and movement in the region or terrain that could accommodate large formations. The Roman army that approached Cannae embodied a choice. This would not be a cautious war of attrition, but a bold war of decisive engagement, and with that choice came a hidden assumption, one that Hannibal would punish, the assumption that enemy would fight in a way that Rome expected. The Roman command system added another layer of vulnerability. Roman consuls alternated command, a political structure that could create inconsistency in operational decision making. In a crisis, alternating command can mean alternating personalities, alternating risk tolerance, alternating tempo. If one commander leans towards caution, another leads towards aggression. The army becomes emotionally and strategically unstable, pulled between two different conceptions of how to win. At Cannae, the Roman leadership's internal friction mattered. An army that is not a body of men, it is a mind expressed through momentum. If the mind is divided, the body can still be strong, but it becomes easier to lure into a trap. Hannibal, who was not constrained by such alternation, could manage a single coherent plan across the entire day that could treat time like a weapon. The Romans, meanwhile, were predisposed to treat time like a schedule: advance, collide, win, return. The plane itself mattered because battle is never only about men and courage, it is about space and perception. On a battlefield, advantage often comes from what enemy cannot see, from what the enemy misreads, from what the enemy believes is happening when something else is happening. Dust, sun, wind, noise, fatigue, thirst, fear. These are not side details, these are ingredients of decision making. A soldier doesn't fight like a clean diagram, he fights with burning lungs, blurred vision, and the pressure of bodies around him. The commander doesn't command like a chess player above the board. He commands through signals, messengers, limited visibility, and distortion of battlefield chaos. Hannibal's deployment at Cannae exploited the physical reality of war. He aligned the battle in such a way that conditions would favor his plan and complicate Roman perception. Even small advantages in visibility and orientation can matter when tens and thousands of men are trying to interpret movement in a storm of dust and noise. When two armies meet, there is an unspoken contest of stories between the contest of steel. Each side carries a narrative that will happen about what will happen. Rome's narrative at Cannae was that its heavy infantry mass would break Hannibal's center. The Roman solution to Hannibal's earlier successes was to concentrate strength in the most direct way possible. Instead of spreading their infantry in broad line, Romans formed a deeper formation. They effectively traded width for depth. This is an important choice because width is related to maneuver and coverage, while depth is related to pushing power and endurance in a straight line. Rome wanted a breakthrough. Rome wanted to punch a hole. The Roman mind pictured victory as forward motion. The enemy lines buckle, the enemy retreats, the Roman mass surges, the battle becomes a chase. That mental picture is seductive, and it becomes dangerous when the enemy is constructing a situation in which your forward motion is the mechanism of your defeat. Hannibal deployed his infantry in a way that looked to the Roman eyes like an invitation. Instead of placing his best infantry in the center, trying to resist Romans' shove directly, he placed a mix of troops in the center. Men who could fight, but who were not meant to serve as immovable woe. He formed them in a forward bulge, a convex shape that jutted toward the Romans. The visual impression mattered. A bulge center can look aggressive, but it can also look vulnerable when it protrudes because it seems like a ripe target for a hammer blow. Hannibal's center was meant to engage, absorb, and retreat in a controlled way. His best infantry, the African veterans, were positioned on the flanks of the infantry line, held back slightly, ready to pivot inward later. This was not random, it was a trap constructed from disciplined patience. Hannibal was telling a story to Rome. Here is my center, break it. At the same time, he was preparing the real story. As you break it, you will step into a narrowing corridor, and my flanks will become your walls. The cavalry arrangement was equally decisive. Hannibal had cavalry superiority in control, often in tactical flexibility. He placed strong cavalry contingents on the flanks with clear operational purpose, defeat Rome's cavalry, then redeploy to attack the Roman infantry from behind. Many commanders win a cavalry fight and then pursue in the intoxication of success. scattered their strength in the chase. Hannibal's cavalry was used as a part of an integrated encirclement. This is a crucial difference. Encirclement is not just surround the enemy as a vague aspiration, it is time sensitive sequence. The cavalry must win enough that the infantry struggle in the center has progressed to the right stage. If the cavalry is delayed, the Roman infantry might break through and escape. If the cavalry wins, then wastes time in pursuit. The rear attack arrives too late. Hannibal's plan required coordination across chaos. The plan also required the enemy to behave a predictable way. Rome did exactly that. The battle began with a kind of violence that collapses theory into instincts. On the flanks, cavalry clashed. The details of who fought where can be debated across sources, but overall pattern remains. Roman cavalry, weaker, fewer in effect, was pressured and broken. On one wing, the Carthaginian cavalry achieved advantage, and instead of turning the battle into a scattered chase, it was brought back into the larger purpose. That is the difference between a tactician and a strategist. A tactician sees local victory. A strategist sees local victory as a tool for a greater ending. A Hannibal needed the cavalry not merely to win but to become a moving wall behind Rome, meaning the infantry in the center met in grinding collision. Roman infantry, the Roman heavy infantry massed deep, pushed forward. They threw their pila, they closed, they began the slow shove of bodies and shields. Hannibal's centers engaged and began to give ground. This is where the trap becomes psychological to the Roman soldier. The enemy is stepping back, looked like success. Success fueled aggression, aggression fueled forward movement, and forward movement in a dense formation compressed the formation itself. Compression reduced maneuverability. Reduced maneuverability increases vulnerability to envelopment. The Roman army's greatest strength was its ability to push forward as a unified mass, was becoming the mechanism by which it was guided into a pocket. It was tempting to imagine the Carthaginian center simply collapsing. That would imply weakness. Hannibal's genius was that it was not a collapse, it was a managed retreat, a controlled bending, like a door swinging inward. The center gradually transformed from a convex bulge into a concave shape, pulling the Roman mass inward. If you have ever watched a crowd move through a narrowing corridor, you know what happens. People press forward, those behind push, those in front cannot slow down even if they want to, and the mass becomes self-propelling. At Cannae, the Roman infantry became a crowd pressing into a corridor formed by the enemy flanks. The more they pressed, the more tightly they packed. The tighter they packed, the less they could fight effectively. The more they relied on the hope that victory was just ahead. One more shove away. This is how annihilation happens. The doom side often feels until late that it is close to winning. At the decisive moment, the African infantry on Hannibal's flanks pivoted inward. This pivot is like knife's edge of the battle's legends. It is one thing to hold formation, it is another to execute a coordinated turning movement under pressure. Against a massive enemy force at the exact moment when the enemy is not vulnerable, the African veterans were not just brave, they were disciplined, experienced, and positioned for the task. As they turned inward, they struck the Roman flanks. The Roman infantry, tightly packed and oriented forward, couldn't easily reorient. Soldiers on the flank suddenly found themselves fighting sideways, while the pressure from behind continues to press the man forward. You cannot fight a battle in which two directions at once, if your formation is too dense to pivot. Romans were being attacked on the sides while still locked in the push to the front. Their formation began to lose coherence, not because they ran, because the geometry of their position made coherent fighting impossible. Then came the final closure, the cavalry returning to strike the rear. A rear attack in the battle isn't merely another angle of violence, it is existential. It tells soldiers that the world behind them, the direction to safety, retreat, the path back to the camp, has become another front. It turns a battle line into a cage. Once the Roman rear was threatened to struck, the psychological structure of the Roman army collapsed. Not in a sense that men became cowards, but in the sense that battles become a trap with no obvious exit. In such a situation, the courage becomes tragic currency. Bravery cannot solve geometry, and a man can be fearless and still surrounded. What followed had been described across centuries as a slaughter. The word isn't poetic. When an army is titled enough, is enclosed tightly enough. Fighting stops being a series of duels or small unit contests and becomes a crushing, suffocating press in which men cannot swing swords, cannot raise shields, cannot even fall without being trampled or pinned. Killing becomes a systematic slaughter, almost industrial in its grim simplicity. The encircling force can rotate fresh men to the front of the killing, while the trapped force has no space to rotate. The trapped force can the trapped force becomes exhausted, dehydrated, wounded, and psychologically shattered. In the center of the pocket, men may not even know what's happening at the edges. They only feel the pressure, the screams, the heat, the smell of blood and dust. In these conditions, even highly trained troops become victims of physics. They are crushed together into helplessness. The battle becomes a place where death is not only delivered by weapons but by suffocating, trampling, shock, and the slow collapse of the human body under relentless pressure. Cannae's horror was amplified by the scale of Roman casualties. Exact number are debated. Ancient sources are not modern statistical reports, but the qualitative truth remains. Rome lost an enormous portion of its field army, including a vast number of citizens, allies, and leaders. The loss of so many men in a single day was not a military catastrophe, it was a political and social trauma. In a citizen army, casualties are not distant. They are your neighbors, your relatives, the son of your friends, the men whose farms will now be unattended, whose wives will now be widows, whose children will now grow without fathers. Rome's system depended on manpower, but manpower isn't infinite. The psychological impact of the defeat was so severe that Rome had to confront the possibility that its allies might defect, that its prestige might collapse, that the war might be lost not by march on Rome, by the slow erosion of Rome's coalition. This is one of the deep strategic truths of Cannae. Hannibal did not necessarily need to seize Rome immediately to gain a strategic advantage. Our decisive battlefield victory can function as political leverage. Hannibal wanted to break the Roman alliance network because Rome was not just a city, it was a web of obligations, fear, incentives, and shared interests. If Rome allies believed Rome could no longer protect them, they would choose survival and defect. Cannae produced exactly that fear. Some Italian communities shifted their alliance. The war's center of gravity moved from the question, can Rome beat Hannibal in battle, to can Rome keep its coalition intact after repeated disasters. Hannibal's victory was designed to make Rome's allies question that truth. Yet Rome didn't surrender. This is one of the most important features of the Cannae story because it reveals that annihilation on the battlefield doesn't always translate into strategic victory. Rome absorbed the defeat and decided with the kind of cold fury that it would not negotiate from weakness. It mobilized more men, it tightened discipline, it expanded recruitment in ways that would have seemed unthinkable in calmer times. It limited mourning, it acted like a state that has decided that survival is worth any cost. Rome's response shows the difference between destroying an army and destroying a political will. Hannibal destroyed an army in Cannae. He didn't destroy Rome's capacity to regenerate. This is the tragic irony. The perfect tactical victory didn't yield immediate strategic collapse. Cannae proved that Rome could be butchered and still refuse to kneel. That refusal would eventually be one of the reasons Hannibal's campaign in Italy, despite its brilliance, couldn't deliver the war's final outcome in his favor. The question that has haunted historians and soldiers is whether Hannibal should have marched to Rome immediately after Cannae. Some have framed it as a missed opportunity, a failure to exploit a moment where Rome was psychologically shaken. Others point out that siege warfare is not a simple extension of battlefield victory, especially for an army operating far from its secure base, in hostile territory, without the heavy logistic apparatus required for sustained assault on a fortified city. Marching on Rome would not be a cinematic parade, it would have been a complex campaign with enormous risk. Hannibal's army have suffered losses too. It was composed of diverse contingents with different languages, tactics, and loyalties. Holding that army together in Italy was itself a strategic feat. A direct assault on Rome might have been a gamble that, if failed, could have destroyed Hannibal's position. The deeper lesson is that war is not a single equation. A move that looks obvious in hindsight may have been irrational in the real strategic landscape. Cannae's lasting significance, however, is less about whether Hannibal marched and more about what the battle revealed about tactical annihilation. The battle became a template, it became a story told to officers, strategists, and political thinkers for centuries. It became an archetype of an encirclement, of turning the enemy's strength into weakness, of achieving a battle of annihilation rather than a battle of attrition. In later ages, military theorists would refer to creating a cannae as an ideal: surround the enemy, crush the flanks, strike the rear, compress the center, destroy the force. That ideal would influence operational plans and battlefield doctrines far beyond the ancient world. While the idea is also a seduction because it can lead commanders to chase the dream of total encirclement when conditions do not permit it. May have tried to replicate cannae, few have succeeded in producing such complete destruction in such a clean tactical sequence. Why is cannae so difficult to replicate, you may ask? Because it requires an unusual alignment of factors: an enemy that is strong but doctrinally predictable, terrain that supports the encircling movement, a cavalry or mobility superiority that can be converted into a rear attack, infantry capable of disciplined control, retreat, and timely pivot, coordination across a chaotic environment, and crucially, an enemy psychological commitment to press forward even as trap closes. Cannae is not merely a trick, it's a complete system. It's a machine that must move smoothly in real conditions. The fact that Hannibal pulled it off speaks to the quality of his leadership and the training and discipline of key parts of his army. This is also a moral and psychological element that makes cannae unforgettable. Many battles are decided by a collapse of morale, by a sudden panic that turns our army into a rout. Cannae wasn't simply a rout, it was a massacre of trapped men. That makes it more terrifying. It suggests that even disciplined soldiers who do not run can be destroyed if strategic situation becomes hopeless. It suggests that bravery isn't always rewarded by survival. It suggests that battlefield can become a place where human agency is crushed by larger geometry. The story of Romans dying packed together, unable to lift their arms properly, is a story that punches romantic visions of war. It replaces them with a more brutal truth. War is not about heroism, it is about systems that can turn man into meat. From the Roman perspective, cannae forced reform and reflection. Rome had to confront weaknesses in command, inflexibility, and in the relationship between political structure and military necessity. In the years that followed, Rome became more careful about giving Hannibal what he wanted. It leaned back towards a strategy of attrition and confinement. It learned painfully that decisive battle can be a trap when the enemy has superior tactical imagination. It also learned the value of a unified command and coherent strategy over alienating leadership. Over, over time, pardon, Over time, Rome's military system evolved. The exact details of reforms are complex and debated across scholarships, but the general direction is clear. Rome's experience pushed it towards greater flexibility, towards professionalization, towards a war-making apparatus that could endure long campaigns and adapt rather than rely solely on citizen militia model. The Roman Republic, which had relied on years cycles of command and seasonal warfare, increasingly faced a world in which wars could be long, global, and strategically layered. Cannae also sharpened Rome's understanding of coalition warfare. Losing an army is catastrophic, but losing allies is existential. Rome understood that the war would not be won. Rome understood that the war would be won not by killing Carthaginians but by holding Italy together. This required political measures, diplomatic pressures, incentives, punishments, and the demonstration that Rome could still protect those who remained loyal. The Republic's refusal to negotiate after Cannae was part of a larger political signal. Rome would not accept a new order in Italy, created by Hannibal's victories. Stubbornness was strategic. It told allies that Rome still believed in its future and believed is a weapon in a coalition warfare. When allies sense a hegemon who has decided to survive at any cost, they are most likely to remain tied to the hegemon because the hegemon's survival becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. From Hannibal's perspective, Cannae was both the summit and the beginning of a slow strategic descent. It was the peak of tactical perfection, the moment when he demonstrated that brilliance could overthrow mass. But it also exposed the limits of battlefield dominance. When it is not supported by the resource of a state capable of sustained replacement and reinforcements, Hannibal's army in Italy could win battles. Rome could lose armies and raise new ones. Over time, the balance of strategic endurance matters. Rome had deeper manpower reserves and critically a political system that could mobilize those reserves and absorb losses without collapsing. Carthage has resources too, but the political and strategic coordination required to fully exploit Hannibal's victories was complicated and contested. Hannibal's campaign relied heavily on personal leadership and his ability to keep a diverse mind intact. That dependence on a single commander itself a strategic vulnerability. A system that depends on a man's genius can achieve astonishing feats, but it can also struggle to convert those feats into durable political outcomes. The battle's double envelopment has often been discussed as if it were purely a tactical geometry, but it has deeper meaning about control. Hannibal's control is not only space, but the enemy's decision. It created a situation in which Roman decisions served Carthaginian ends. Romans' push forward became why they believed forward motion was victory and believed that exactly what Hannibal wanted. This is why Cannae is still studied in context battlefield. It is a case study of how to shape an opponent's behavior. If you can predict what opponent wants, what the opponent fears, what the opponent interprets certain cues, you can design a trap that uses the enemy's own legacy against them. Hannibal didn't force Rome to enter the pocket at sword point. He invited Rome, and Rome walked in. This is where Cannae becomes not only a military story, but a story about the structure of failure. Many catastrophes in war and in life occur when a system causes confusion and motion with progress. Rome's infantry moved forward, it took ground, it pushed the enemy back, it believed it was winning, and in reality, it was being guided into a position where success on the surface was failure underneath. The pattern appears in many domains. A business that expands rapidly may be walking into a cash flow trap. A political movement that wins early headlines can be walking into a legitimacy crisis. A person who chases a quick victory may be walking into a long term destruction. Cannae is a brutal reminder that forward movement can be engineered by an opponent. The obvious path is not the path someone else wants you to take. The Roman formation at Cannae also reveals an important truth about concentration. Concentration of force is a classical principle of war, but like all principles, it has conditions. Concentration can create overwhelming pressure at a point of contact, but it can also create vulnerability to encirclement and reduce flexibility. There is a difference between concentrating power and compressing yourself into immobility. Rome's deep formation was an attempt to concentrate its infantry strength, but it also became a form of compression that limited options. Once the flanks were threatened, the dense mass couldn't easily pivot, redeploy, or create gaps for maneuver. The formation became a liability. The lesson is not about concentration is always wrong. It is that concentration must be balanced with maneuver, with the ability to respond to threats from multiple directions. A formation can only win by moving forward is a formation that can be lured. Another reason is the relationship between arms. Rome's heavy infantry was superb in its role, but the war is rarely won by one arm alone. Hannibal's integration of cavalry and infantry, using cavalry not only for fights but for operational encirclement, demonstrates combined arms thinking in ancient Roman context. The cavalry was not a decorative force; it was decisive in shaping the battle's outcome. Rome's weakness in cavalry contributed heavily to its inability to prevent the encirclement. In a broad sense, Cannae demonstrated that superiority in one dimension can be neutralized by inferiority in the other. When the enemy exploits the mismatch, the Romans were superior in infantry numbers and arguably in infantry quality, but Hannibal's superiority in cavalry and tactical decisions allowed him to turn that Roman advantage into a trap. Leadership also matters in a specific way at Cannae. Hannibal was not merely a commander who gave orders, he was a commander who designed an ecosystem of action. He positioned himself and his officers to influence morale and timing. He relied on veteran troops for the crucial pivot because he understood that not all units can execute complex maneuvers under pressure. He placed the center under his direct influence because it needed to hold and retreat in disciplined right rather than collapse. This reveals a sophisticated understanding of human variability. Certain tasks required certain types of troops. You do not ask unreliable men to execute the most dedicated turn of the battle. You ask them to do what they can, while your most dependable men perform the decisive act. Hannibal's deployment was an expression of a leader who understood his tools intimately. In the end, Battle of Cannae endures as a permanent lesson because it is both simple and profound. Simple in the sense that its core mechanism can be explained in a sentence: lure the enemy center forward, crush the flanks, strike the rear, enclose, and destroy. Profound in a sense that it exposes a deep structure of power and failure. It shows how an opponent can weaponize your habits. It shows how the desire for decisive victory can be a vulnerability. It shows how tactical brilliance can achieve annihilation without guaranteeing strategic success. It shows how an army can be destroyed not by lack of courage but by loss of options. It shows how the battlefield can become a machine that converts human bodies into statistics, and it shows how, perhaps, that an empire can be brought to the edge of a collapse in a single day and still decides to fight on because of the will of a state, not same as the life of an army. Rome lost at Cannae because it tried to solve intelligence and adaptability with mass. Hannibal won because he solved mass with design. That is exactly how you win a war with inferior numbers.